So let me tell you about some of the research on touch. So first of all, touch of the right kind can reduce fear and pain. In one study by Richie Davidson, they actually had partners go in, and one partner was going to be they looked at brain scans, fMRI, and there was going to be a very loud white noise that was going to happen, that when they first looked at the brain, the anticipation increased those regions of the brain for fear and pain. However, when the person was sitting there anticipating, if they were with a romantic partner who was soothing and touching and stroking their arm, it switched off the fear and pain response. There was actually no indication of fear and response just by having the partner do that soothing touch. Some other research actually shows that just the right kind of touch can decrease stress, increase immune functioning, and even help trusting relationships, create safety and trust, just as simple as a touch. And in learning, they find that it actually leads to greater engagement in learning. One study in France actually found that just a slight pat on the back by a teacher actually increased the likelihood 3 times that the student would participate in class and be more engaged in the learning environment. Now, what we also know about touch is, besides increasing trust and reducing cortisol and other kinds of stress responses, it also leads to something of an increase in oxytocin. And let me tell you, how many of you have heard of oxytocin? Oh, I love it. Okay, let me just tell you a bit about oxytocin. So what we know is there's been some of the research that really sort of spurred our interest in oxytocin was done by Sue Carter. And she first started looking at voles. I don't know if any of you know what a vole is. There's prairie ones and montane voles. And one of the things that distinguishes voles is one sort of vole has oxytocin receptors, the prairie vole, and the montane vole does not. And what they found, they did some research where they had the vole, who was not related, and put little pups, like little baby voles, next to the vole who was not related to them, and it increased their oxytocin release just by being around that small new baby vole. So what I'd like to recommend to you, and actually might be part of the Roots of Empathy program for some of you, that actually being around infants may be increasing your oxytocin levels. But why is oxytocin good for you? Some of you know this already. Oxytocin is kind of the love hormone. It increases affiliation and bonding and trust, reduces stress. There are so many good things about oxytocin. And we used to just focus on things related to sort of nursing and childbirth. We thought it was just around with mothers, but we now know that we all have oxytocin. And it's important for creating trusting relationships. It reduces fear, our fear response. It also helps create a bonding and affiliation. And it also does things that break down social barriers. One study, now they do some research where you can actually have this nasal spray of oxytocin. This is true, where you can, and they're actually using it to treat a lot of different social problems, social anxiety and things like that. But anyways, this one study came in and had people looked at generosity, and they found that those individuals that had an increase in oxytocin through this nasal spray, it increased generosity and giving by 80%. So the other good thing about oxytocin that we know, besides you get it through being around social relationships and touch, is that it's pretty easy to get. So maybe not the spray one, but I will say, so oxytocin, by holding someone's hand, shaking their hand. So actually what I just did, it increased your oxytocin. In that simple connection was increasing your sense of connection to each other, increasing your sense of trust and safety. Other ways is through a hug. Hugs actually increase your oxytocin. And any of you have dogs? Okay, just so you know, recent science shows that oxytocin actually increases. If you pet your dogs, that your oxytocin increases and so does your dog's. So there's a whole connection there between oxytocin and our human relationships. It's really essential. So the second kind of insight about from science about human connection is really about how important empathy is for our survival and the idea of being connected with each other. Now, the definition of empathy is about an individual's emotional responsiveness to the feelings of another person. And we're finding more and more how empathy is so critical to our survival of our species by helping each other. Empathy, by some, is considered the most important of all personality traits because it not only decreases our sort of tendency to be aggressive, it actually increases our prosociality, our wanting to reach out and help someone, to be compassionate, to lead to altruism and helping someone else. And in fact, Dr. Keltner, who's actually from the Greater Good Science Center, talks about it's not survival of the fittest, it's survival of the kindest, and really showing from an evolutionary standpoint that empathy is essential to our ability to help others and to be kind and to be connected. Empathy also is important for social relationships and is really so critical for our ability to help us feel connected to another person, to want to be helpful and to be in a positive social situation. Now, what about the development of empathy? And I'm going to tell you a little bit about this. So what we know from the research is that empathy, the beginning of empathy, or the roots or seeds of empathy, develop within the first 24 hours of birth. That actually they do studies of babies in nurseries, and when a baby hears another infant crying, they start crying. They do not cry when they have computerized generated crying, the sounds of their own crying or other loud noises. The loud crying is really just in response to another human infant. And how important that is sort of setting the stage. And what we know is the roots of empathy are really three. Norma Feshbach talks about this. To be able to develop empathy, you first need to identify emotions in other people. You need to be able to look at their face and see what those emotions are. You second need to be able to take the perspective of another person and be able to think how they might be feeling. And third, you need to be able to have that emotional responsivity. And some of the recent neuroscience has talked about something called mirror neurons. Has anyone heard of mirror neurons? And this notion, this discovery a couple of decades ago really allowed us to see that actually you have neurons that when you see someone else's pain or see someone else's behavior, that you actually can feel the same way. It's kind of the empathy neuron of being able to see their experiences and experience them at the same time. So things like what we call as emotional contagion. So for example, Sean did a great job of actually talking about like when you smile, you see other people smiling. So when you see someone being really happy, you feel their happiness. It's contagious. And this notion of how these roots of empathy helps us be connected to others. But there's also something called a stress contagion. So even when you're, some recent research shows that even if you are not stressed, well, first of all, I have to ask, did any of you experience stress? Okay. So what's so interesting is some of the recent science really showing that even if you are not stressed, if you're around others in your close network who are highly stressed, you actually have the physiological experiences, negative experiences of being stressed. And in fact, even in the classroom, we're finding some recent research shows that if teachers are highly stressed teachers, actually leads to more problems, internalizing and sort of anxiety and depression and externalizing disorders in their students. So it's kind of one of my recent things of how essential it is for us to help teachers and care for teachers because of the ramifications it has for students. Some of the other research is showing that empathy is on the decline in our youth. A study of 14,000 college students from the years 1979 to 2009, where they used the same empathy measure every year among cohorts, found that there was a significant decline in self-reports of empathy, particularly since the year 2000. So we need to start thinking about what might be the mechanisms underlying this decreased empathy. So the third thing I want to talk about in terms of an insight is the importance of social relationships and how essential these relationships are for everything we do. And I'm going to use the case of really talking about working with young people and the whole notion of what role do important supportive adults play in the lives of young people. And so I'm going to begin with a story. People who have seen me speak before know that I often like to give a story about one of my own personal experiences of working with students. Maria did a wonderful introduction, but one thing some of you might know that I actually started off my career as a teacher. I was a 7th and 8th grade teacher and then a teacher at an alternative high school. And then after teaching at the high school, I went and worked in basically a mental institution for children who were considered hopeless cases. And it was at the University of Chicago. It was called the Orthogenic School. And it was built on this notion of a therapeutic milieu. And I lived there for 3.5 years and worked there at the same time. And worked with these kids who were considered hopeless cases. So I'm going to tell you a story about Jeff and the scrambled eggs. I hope I'm not making anybody hungry here. So I started working at the school where you live and work, and it was made famous by Bruno Bettelheim in the 1950s, 1960s as being this really unique approach to the treatment of severe mental illness. And Bruno Bettelheim had actually come as a psychologist, but actually had been in 2 concentration camps, Dachau and Buchenwald, before he was released. I believe it was on Hitler's birthday. They would do things like that, and he was released and sent to Chicago, and the University of Chicago hired him, and he created this new kind of school for the treatment of kids with severe mental illness based on the notion that you can do the opposite of a concentration camp. How he had survived in concentration camps is by watching how people's mental health problems can emerge, and the loss of autonomy and torture. So he decided to do the opposite of a concentration camp and create a therapeutic milieu that was about compassion and kindness and taking the voices of children, being a really child-centered approach. So I went to go work there, and at first I was a sub. The kids lived in dorms. There were 3 boys' dormitories and 3 girls' dormitories with about 7 to 8 kids in each one. And the boys' dormitories, there was one that was kind of famous. They were called the Lords. And one of the young men, 14-year-old Jeff, was considered to be the worst child who had ever been in the school's entire history. He was a kid who had had severe abuse as a child, was very abusive to all of his female counselors, not so much to his male counselors, and in fact, he wouldn't even let his female counselors touch even a clean towel of his. And I'll give you a bit of background of what had happened to him. But he was kind of notorious, and I would go to, and at that time I was like a substitute teacher, a substitute counselor, and so, for several months I would maybe go and work with different dormitories, and the kids don't really get to know you. If anybody knows that you just don't have your own group of kids, but I kept on hearing Jeff's name over and over again, like in the staff room, Jeff, and then I'd hear his female counselor would be in the staff room at the end of her shift in the evening crying and saying, Jeff, oh, what happened? And, so he was well known. So Jessica, his counselor, decided to leave the school, and Jackie Sanders, the director of the school at that time, came and told me, Kim, we have a placement for you now to have your own dorm. It's in the Lords. And I said, oh, great. No, I was excited. I was excited about it, and I thought, finally. And so one of the things that we were told or 2 of the things we were told when we started working at the school, first, lead with compassion. Second, find something you like about every single child. It was all about being compassionate. So that first day, as they were announced, Jackie announced to the kids that I was going to be their new counselor at dinner. I was sitting at my table, and the Lord's group was sitting over there. Jeff walked past me and said, I'd like you to come up to the dorm after you're finished eating. And I thought, oh, this is so nice. He's like, lets me finish eating. So I go up to the dorm afterward, and he's kind of pacing, very anxious kid, pacing. One thing I didn't mention about Jeff, he was severely disturbed with 170 IQ. So he was pacing around and he said, he had a bed and his rug. That's how the dorms were set up and he had a laundry bin. And he said, I sometimes throw my dirty laundry on the floor, and I would like you to pick it up and put it in here. And he showed me where the laundry bin was. And I said, great. And some of you are going, really? I felt it was a great connection. He was asking me to pick up his dirty laundry. He was reaching out. I really felt that. So anyway, so I did. And I actually was really delighted because I felt like this is some kind of connection he's making with me. It's picking up his dirty laundry. but it's a connection nonetheless. After I did that, after a few months, and I remember the first time he asked me to go get him a clean towel. It was the first time he had ever asked a female counselor to get him a clean towel, because they had to go different places. And so then what happened, after that, slowly and surely, he would ask me to do these different things for him. Actually, it was so fascinating because, he never had me do certain things, any other female counselors and things like that. And so the next thing he asked me to do was to actually clip his fingernails. Isn't that just strange? I just felt like at first, like he wants me to touch him. And I don't know if any of you, I'm like totally anxious about clipping my own kids' fingernails because you're always worried you're going to. So I set it up and he let me touch him and cut his fingernails. Then a few months later, one thing at the school, the kids lived there full time. We had a night counselor. So if there was a nightmare or something, something happened to the kids, they would go to the night counselor. But we lived in the school. So one middle of the night, 2:00, knock on my door. Jeff's standing there with his arms folded. Make me scrambled eggs. I said, okay. Let's go down to the kitchen and get some eggs, and we'll go up, and we had a little mini kitchen out of the dorm. And so I talked to him all along the way, and I did this. And what I was thinking is, why would he come? Like someone might say, come on, don't go back to bed. But I realized Jeff had probably had a nightmare. He would probably woke up in the middle of the night scared. And what do? You can't go and say, I'm scared. He yet hadn't been able to do that. He asked me to make him these scrambled eggs. And so I did. And slowly but surely, he had told me about, which I already knew, about some of the abuse he had suffered as a child, both at home and from sexual abuse from a neighbor, a babysitter, a number of things that are kind of, you just wonder how he could even be alive still, given what he had been through. So at a year after I'd been working with him, he decided he wanted to have an anniversary little gift for me. And he said, because one thing at the school, what we would do is every year, as the number of years the kids had been there, we would actually buy as many gifts as the number of years, and each gift we'd wake them up in the morning on the day of their anniversary and give them a gift that each one represented some growth they had for while they had been at the school. So Jeff said, I want to make you breakfast in bed. I said, but I get you up for school. I first have to get you up for school. So we had this whole thing where I had to get the kids up to school, and then I had to go back to my room, and he had to come to my room, and he came with this tray and put, had eggs. I don't know if they were scrambled, and, a card he had written for me. And he basically said, you might not know this, but that night that I woke you up and you made the scrambled eggs, it transformed me. Because I thought, I'm a horrible, horrible person. And then I thought, if Kim would get up in the middle of the night and make me eggs happily, maybe I'm not such a bad kid. He did say, because it's a very classic Jeff thing, those were the worst scrambled eggs I ever had. Because he's totally got that sense. But for me, it underlined the importance of this human connection, this importance of approaching people with compassion and kindness and their behaviors and trying to overcome that. So it really led me on a path to really studying the importance of adults in children's lives. And this is one of my favorite quotes, that every child deserves someone in his or her life who's actually crazy about them. And what we know is from the science of resiliency, 5 decades of research shows us that the most important ingredient to resiliency, to helping individuals overcome adversity, are social relationships. And some of the most other recent research shows the important relationship of one significant adult in the lives of children. We've done some research on this, and this is a study we did in Vancouver at a school, and we looked at things like empathy and self-esteem, and found that among 4th to 7th graders, it isn't just one adult. Actually, the kids, you see this staircase, the kids who have 0 are lowest. Kids who have 1 significant adult at school are higher, but those kids who have 2 or more adults at their school who they see as important are able to have these higher levels. And when we ask kids, what is it that makes an adult important to you? Do you know how simple it is? We did one study, and we found at a high school, kids said what teachers do to show they care, they say hello to me in the hallway by my name. I see you. I know who you are. And I think the other thing they told us is just teachers who check in with them. And in fact, when we content analyzed and coded all the different responses that kids said, the number one category was teachers who were supportive, or adults at school, supportive and nurturant, and how critical this is for their well-being. And we now have other research that with something called the Middle Years Development Instrument, a population-based measure of child well-being that's being used across BC and other parts of the world. We're now piloting it across Canada. It's being used in Australia. It's been used in Peru through World Bank. And the thing is that we find how important these adult relationships are. And in fact, in one study by one of my doctoral students, Ava Oberle, found that the best predictor of students' social and emotional learning was supportive adults in school, above and beyond socioeconomic status and even relationships with parents or neighbors. Now, I'm going to just share with you some of the recent findings for the MDI. We asked in a number of school districts last year, are there any adults at your school who are important to you? And what we found is the fourth graders, 22% said no one. If you look at the number of fourth graders we have in British Columbia right now, that translates to 10,000 fourth graders who say, right now in our province, who say there's no adult at school who's important to them. Seventh grade, it even goes down, and this really shows some of the research on the notion of important adults, which we find as kids move up that adults aren't seen as supportive, and we don't know if do they become more discerning on what makes an adult important. In grade 4, they might actually say, well, that adult's important to me because they care about me. Seventh graders might be more skeptical, like you're really paid to be here, and those kinds of things. But again, we see that a large proportion of seventh graders, 37%, say there's not one adult. And that actually translates into 17,000 seventh graders in our province who say they do not have an important adult in their life. And what I want to both instigate is the idea, and really reiterate what Sean said, is how easy it is to be connected to our young people. A smile, a pat on the back, just these simple things to notice kids and see them and where they are. So some of the questions that I have include, why is empathy decreasing in our young people? I think some people want to right away say social media, but I actually have another interpretation. Could it be that we're born so empathic that now that children are so exposed to things happening around the world, they actually shut off their empathy? Think about all of the things they watch that are happening around the world. Could you actually have empathy fatigue as a result of seeing all of those? If the identification of emotions is so central to the development of empathy, what happens when children have limited face-to-face connection? What happens, especially during sensitive periods of development? And finally, what role does social media play in our need for human connection? Is, in fact, it's just so fascinating to me how much, as Maria was saying, this notion of being connected and having our phone around. I know for me, being connected to my boys and things, is it, in fact, our drive to be connected really related to this increase in how we are, and how do we reconcile that? So I'm looking forward to learning the rest of the day, and thank you very much.